I was born in El Paso, Texas, while my parents were there under special orders of Congress, Operation Paperclip. They were living in William Beaumont Annex housing at Fort Bliss with the Werner von Braun team. About half of the team were taken by bus daily out to White Sands Proving Grounds so that they could share with captains of industry and professors and various ones that were interested in what is this unique thing, this rocket that they built back in Germany during the war.
Answer to the V2. It was so fast and very destructive. I was born in 1936, so I remember the war pretty well. Grew up through the Blitz in Portsmouth. Had my first experience with injury when a V1 came down on my street. It killed all the neighbors and my uncle. It was kind of strange. I'm on the receiving end of the vengeance weapons of Germany. And 20 years later, I'm sitting with Werner von Braun in the blockhouse. Von Braun was primarily the V2. If the Germans had had it a year or more earlier, it could have made an effect on the results of the war.
I myself and everybody you see here have decided to go west, and I think our decision was not one of expediency, but a moral decision. We knew that we had created a new means of warfare, and the question as to what victorious nation we were willing to entrust this brainchild of ours was a moral decision more than anything else.
I don't feel they were really happy working on what they thought was a weapon, but they saw it that it was the Americans against the Russians in the Cold War that was starting to brew. And in that way, I feel they thought that they could now maybe make amends for what had occurred before.
The V2 was streets ahead of its time. That rocket was the foundation for the Redstone rocket. The Redstone stepped into the Jupiter. We then took a Jupiter tank and 8 Redstone rockets and built a Saturn I. Then we took that whole concept and built the Saturn V. And von Braun had his hand in that from day one.
Amid the fertile farmlands of northern Alabama, the Army consolidates its expanding missile activities late in 1949. World War II Army ammunition and chemical warfare installations are joined and reactivated as Redstone Arsenal. Early in 1950, the Army moves the former German missile experts, other components of its missile team, and some military personnel here to continue rocket development.
When I graduated from Auburn University, jobs were hard to find. I ran a service station for a while trying to make a little money, but one weekend I went home and a friend of mine told me they were hiring people over in Huntsville.
I was interviewed by one of the Germans, Dr. Hinze, and I was impressed by him. I was not impressed by the facility, though, nor the equipment they had. They were very austere, quonset huts and concrete block buildings that had been part of the munitions. I deliberated over it and finally I decided, well, I believe it's worth a chance. And that, of course, about the best decision I ever made was to come. And so I came in March of '52.
Germans had been exposed to several vehicles when they were at White Sands, so I think they pretty much had in mind the Redstone.
What the Russians did, we had to counter. And the Russians, we had heard, had a 200-mile range guided missile.
We assembled and checked out that Redstone vehicle, and then they would carry it over to the test stand and do the firing.
Blast!
I never saw it in any light except for space. The Army may have, but I certainly didn't.
It became evident quite early that even though our mission was to develop a launch vehicle, Dr. von Braun's vision was space travel.
Well, I remember going home on weekend and talking to guys. They always asked me the same question. They thought it was sort of a Buck Rogers type thing. I was pretty much convinced them it wasn't Buck Rogers. We were going to do it.
Moscow newspapers were first. Then headlines around the world echoed the news. Russia had blasted a man-made moon into outer space. On every continent and in every land, the story of Sputnik 1 dominated the front pages. In its orbit, 560 miles above the Earth, the satellite reached a speed of 18,000 miles an hour, circling the globe once every 96 minutes.
I was still in graduate school down at LSU when the Russians put up Sputnik. It was just a shock to the entire country. I've never seen it that way before. The Americans realized that here was technology that they could not stop. It was almost panic in the street.
We were all peeved off because we had just launched a Redstone, which we had to put a dummy fourth stage in it to keep it from orbiting.
Eisenhower didn't want the Germans to put up a satellite. So they let a whole new contract to the Navy, and the Navy built a completely new rocket to put up a satellite about the size of a grapefruit.
The only rationale I can think of is that they were trying to keep civilian space travel and military separate, but they had extreme difficulties.
What would have been the difference between the Navy and the Army? From a military aspect, it's a bad thing to say, but I think it was more of a jealousy that had been developed between von Braun being a German and the political people.
President Smith of the United Press, Russia has launched an Earth satellite. I asked you, sir, what are we going to do about it?
The Soviets have proved again, and indeed, this launching of the satellite proves that they can hurl an object, but there are a lot of other things in the scientific inquiry that are not yet answered and which we are pushing ahead to answer.
Eisenhower thought it was a joke, but a month later the Russians put the dog up, and it was a several-ton spacecraft, and it shocked everybody. And that's when the Army got to go ahead.
Good morning, gentlemen. Be seated, please. I have a very important announcement for you. We've been assigned the mission of launching a scientific Earth satellite. I promised the Secretary of the Army that we would be ready in 90 days or less. Let's go, Werner.
But Darius knew that we had the capability with our little Redstone, and so he authorized us to build an extra rocket that would be used specifically to put up a satellite. And we did. We designed it and built it, and it was all done in a secret. The Secretary of Defense asked him, if you really think you can put up a satellite, how quick can you do it? But Darius said, well, we better take 3 months. He didn't admit he had it already in the warehouse.
This is Roger, Command. My command mark design will be X minus 75
had a lot of confidence. You know, we had thoroughly tested every part of that vehicle. Of course, I won't deny that I wasn't a little bit on the nervous side. After all, it was a little different than just putting the vehicle in the air. I was chief of electrical on the ground. I just knew that that stuff was ready. I'm sure that's the same feeling all of them had.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Fire command! Fire command! Ignition! Lift off!
It took time for me to realize what a significant night that was. I was 16. We were at a golf course. It was where all the high schoolers went to make out. My brother comes roaring in and just shouts, "We've put up the first American satellite." You know, most of them don't use the word satellite back then. And they're having a celebration downtown. The whole idea was, let's go downtown and party.
It was on my birthday. Here's this one little square with the old courthouse around it.
All the firecrackers going off. And I was thinking, what are they doing there burning that scarecrow? And I said, that's Charles E. Wilson, our Secretary of Defense, who let the Russians beat us. You know, those old country guys, they were just as excited as high school kids. And so it was just there was thousands of people down there. You would think that everyone was really aware we were striving to get into space this much.
It was a big boost for morale, particularly those of us involved. We're into space business now, not only military rocket business. So it became more and more open that, hey, we were headed for doing some other things in space, too.
There was a sea change at that point in time. People knew that space was going to be where it happened. And so there was a lot of pressure to do what needed to be done.
In the beginning, it was just too hectic to think about myself. I had one child right after another. I didn't have time to think of what I wanted. But then when my daughters all got in school, and I had this time to myself, I thought, gosh, I would really like to be part of the space program.
I got involved in a science fair, the first ever one, I think, here at Titusville High School. And I will tell you that my father had a hand in this because he did some things to help. But I had a display of a rocket engine. And the Army Ballistic Missile Agency had people at that science fair. And when that science fair got over, I was offered a job at the Army Ballistic Missile Agency at Cape Canaveral.
My husband looked at me and he said, what could you do? You couldn't make enough money to buy your own Kotex. That's all the motivation I needed. We were divorced shortly after that, and I was a single mother raising 3 daughters on my own with very little monetary assistance. And I just knew I had to make it.
It was a launch every 3rd or 4th day, or a test every day. I was a civilian employee, and I got to be a technician. My first impression was it was kind of like a big family. I was really taken in. I was the youngest guy by far, 17 years old. And I didn't know A from Z, but they were willing to teach me. It was special. They cared about whether I was going to be successful or not.
I took a job as a Kelly girl, and you probably don't know what that is. It was a temporary position, and usually it was a temporary either typist or secretary. I got several jobs with different contractors. They would last anywhere from 3 months to 6 months. And finally, I got a job with IBM. I liked the way they treated people. I liked the company, the atmosphere, and they offered me a full-time job. And that turned out to be a wonderful blessing.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States. The momentum thus gained accelerates today under the civilian management of the new National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Marvel as we will at these technical achievements, we must not overlook this truth. All that we have already accomplished and all in the future that we shall achieve is the outgrowth not of a soulless, barren technology, nor of a grasping state imperialism. It is the product of unrestrained human talent and energy, restlessly probing for the betterment of humanity. In this tribute to a revered friend, I dedicate this to George C. Marshall Space Flight Center.
I'm in my second year now. I still don't know a lot. And we all get transferred from the Army Ballistic Missile Agency into this new agency called NASA. And NASA had two major differences from the ABMA. Number one, it was aimed at peaceful uses of space right from the beginning. And number two, exploration, discovery, and education.
I remember my parents having those discussions. Do you go? Do you stay with Army where it's a sure thing? The ultimate decision was that NASA means going into space rather than the Army building missiles and armaments for war.
We didn't even initially have any new specific focus. We were working on the capability to put men in orbit. The big event was President Kennedy's decision that we needed to do something to prove we were technologically superior to the Russians. That's really what the genesis of the whole lunar program is about.
Well, I was very impressed with him. I remember when he laid out the goal, let's go to the moon in 10 years and return safely back to Earth. I mean, that was the kind of goal and the kind of thing that you could get yourself attached to. It was a big deal in the South, and I guess gave people hope, which was the biggest thing. You know, once there's hope, you can make a lot of stuff happen.
It was just an incredibly exciting challenge that the country was put on notice to do this and to do it within a particular time and to commit.
In May of '61, I think it was, all we'd flown was Shepard on a suborbital flight. And here we are, you know, making plans to go to the moon within 9 years, basically. And, you know, at that stage of the industry, I thought, I don't know how we're ever going to do that.
Von Braun was essentially dancing in the street, you know. He's finally arrived. He's got a real mission now to get man in space in a serious way. But it was interesting. The guys down in the ranks would say, what? How are we going to do this?
I don't think I was savvy enough to understand what the real implications were at that point in time. I was savvy enough to know that that meant there was a real thread of power and ambition and challenge that would become a part of my life.
Even though I realize that this is, in some measure, an act of faith and vision, for we do not now know what benefits await us. But if I were to say, my fellow citizens, that we shall send to the moon, 240,000 miles away, a giant rocket more than 300 feet tall, made of new metal alloys, some of which have not yet been invented, and do all this and do it right, and do it first before this decade is out, then we must be bold. It will be done, and it will be done before the end of this decade. And therefore, as we set sail, we ask God's blessing on the most hazardous and dangerous and greatest adventure on which man has ever embarked.
I went to work for the Army Corps of Engineers. It was either one of the generals or a colonel that came out and said, JFK wants to put a man on the moon. They're going to build a space center in Florida. Any volunteers? My father was in construction. He ran a transit mix concrete company. He always said, remember the 4 C's. Just be able to communicate, coordinate, cooperate, and have credibility. He said if you don't have credibility to start with, you'll never succeed. You might make money, but you're not going to be a success as a human being. It was just boondocks when we got here. I mean, 2-lane road into an awful lot of orange groves. The Corps of Engineers had a real estate office, and they were buying a lot of property on Merritt Island.
It's not actually an island, it's a peninsula. And the north end of that peninsula is where the Merritt Island launch area was established, Launch Complex 39.
Launch Complex 39, a new operational facility for launching large space vehicles at a more rapid rate. This new mobile concept calls for assembly of the moon rocket in the controlled environment of a building. Then, with the rocket mounted on a mobile launcher, a huge tracked vehicle transfers it to a distant pad ready for launch.
The mobile concept was different than any concept they had anywhere else out there. They calculated the explosive rating of a fully fueled Saturn V as being a circle 7 miles diameter. They picked the locations for Pad A and Pad B, so all the inhabitable buildings had to be outside that 7-mile circle.
It was a huge difference, not just in scale of size, but in complexity as well. Hard to put in place, expensive, with lots of growing pains.
So it got to where you had to have a master schedule of what was happening overall.
We had war rooms, they called it.
Are there any changes to the schedule? The tank pressurization test will not start until 1300.
When do you want to run the leak check?
First shift Tuesday.
You would meet 6:30, 6:45. You tracked every job, whether you're ahead of schedule, on schedule, behind schedule.
Everybody knew what the final goal was, and nobody wanted to be the cause for having to move that goal.
We started building launch pads, having to make channels and 200 and 300 feet high piles of sand to surcharge over the swamp area.
Keep in mind now, it was a wildland area, and the water systems had to be diverted. So we cut off north-south flow. That didn't go over very well for some of our naturalists. We put a huge crawlerway, 3 miles long, 10 feet deep, and it is the size of a 4-lane highway.
My boss, Mr. Donald Buchanan, was a design engineer of the crawler transporter. It was patterned after some of these big steam shovels that they used to use to dig coal mines and such. Dimensionally, it was about the size of a baseball infield. And the belt on the track, 2 of them on each one, was about the size of a Greyhound bus. I remember the first time we ever moved it. We started having problems with a little heavier load than we had designed for, and the bearings were wearing out. And that's when this ingenious young engineer decided if we could get some river rock and put a layer on the crawlerways. The river rock would act like ball bearings between the tracks and the ground. And you could hear those rocks popping, and they were being pulverized. And we've used that river rock ever since to save our bearings.
That was only a part of it. The Launch Control Center was a part of it. The launch pads themselves, 50 feet above sea level, underneath a whole catacomb of wires and piping. It's a little city out there.
And it was all happening at the same time. It's not step by step. It's somebody's working on the structural while somebody's working on the mechanical while somebody's working on the electrical.
Construction people are a bunch of different people. I'll tell you, some of them are a wild group, but most of them had a lot of pride in their work. A lot of jobs worked, a lot of overtime. I really am not trying to be the rah-rah, but I think there was a spirit that said, we're going to beat the Russians to the moon. It wasn't a case of, hell, it's a job. Yeah, there were a few people like that, but not very many.
Today, I have stood where once Jefferson Davis stood and took an oath to my people. In the name of the greatest people that have ever trod this earth, I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
You know, the first time George Wallace ran for governor, he was, I guess, a moderate, inclusive type guy and all that stuff, you know. And then he lost. And he made a statement that I will never lose another election by supporting blacks. You know, he used the N-word.
We lived on Pulaski Pike. During that time, all of Huntsville was segregated. The way we went to school was going down the railroad track. You wouldn't be going through anybody's neighborhood.
If you didn't have at least 8 students taking a class, the state of Alabama wouldn't pay for it. So once you got past basic math, we didn't have enough students for the state to pay for a teacher. But we had this one teacher, Frank Holly, and I give him a lot of credit for being here today. He came back after school to teach us trigonometry for free of charge.
High school, I had the teacher, Mrs. Fearn, and she would tell me that you got a good head on your body for being a mathematician, and I guess that stuck, and that's what I tried to do.
Because of the influx of highly educated workers, today Huntsville combines the charm and relaxed atmosphere of a quiet southern community with the intellectual curiosity and activity of a major university city.
We are confronted primarily with a moral issue. It is as old as the scriptures and is as clear as the American Constitution. The heart of the question is whether all Americans are to be afforded equal rights and equal opportunities. Whether we are going to treat our fellow Americans as we want to be treated. Now the time has come for this nation to fulfill its promise. The events in Birmingham and elsewhere have so increased the cries for equality that no city or state or legislative body can prudently choose to ignore them. A great change is at hand, and our task, our obligation, is to make that revolution, that change, peaceful and constructive for all.
President John F. Kennedy issued Executive Order 10-925 establishing a new program of equal employment opportunity in the federal service. Its meaning is quite clear. As federal employees, you should be mindful that the executive order, like the Civil Service Act, carries with it a strong injunction against discriminatory acts in the federal service.
Marshall got threatened that if they didn't do a better job of integrating, they was going to move that space center somewhere else. They didn't want to lose all those jobs and all that stuff. So that's money always makes a difference in getting things changed, you know.
I think it was a great thing. A lot of African Americans didn't ever think they would be able to start working for NASA. Clyde Foster, Richard Hall, and Norman Fletcher, those are some of the first ones that were able to get out there. And I think it opened the door for other African Americans in our communities.
You know, they helped me a lot, especially Clyde. You know, he kind of helped mentor me along. My first job was a computer operator, so I go to this room. You know, we had lights flashing and tapes going, and I was scared to death. A guy from Auburn started the same day that I did, and his major was math, and I soon found out that I knew as much as he did.
They did set up this co-op program, which allowed students from universities and colleges to apply for summer work.
I didn't really see it as breaking color barriers. I just saw it as achieving as much as I could. When I became deputy center director at Kennedy, and it wasn't like I wanted to be deputy center director because I was black. I wanted to be deputy center director because that was the next job up, you know. But I always knew that I carried a certain responsibility by being a black in certain positions. I couldn't afford to fail, so I always did whatever it took to be successful. I never worked 8-hour days. I was like 10 to 12-hour days all my career.
When I became supervisor, I had about 4 African-American students, and most of them are female at that, working under me in the computation lab. Some of the employees, friends now, will come up and tell me, I'm so glad that you were there to help me. If you hadn't been there to put in a good word for me or tell me what to do, I probably wouldn't have made it.
I was in the laboratory. Somebody came running in and said, Kennedy has been shot. I just visualized it as a minor wound. We could hardly believe it. Hard to talk about. But, you know, it just wasn't right. And we were all affected by it.
It made me feel a degree of insignificance. If people who are in the limelight, who are doing great things, can be so easily disposed of, then who am I? It just kind of put that in perspective. There's a price for notoriety. When you get to be known, there's a vulnerability. Assassination is one of them. That's the ultimate vulnerability. Especially if you're doing something that's against the grain of a certain set of people.
You know, this was a guy that we as black people had hung our hopes on, that was going to, you know, change things and make life better for us. And all of a sudden he was gone, you know.
I don't know, maybe I was so shocked over the event, I didn't even think a whole lot about its effect on the space program. We certainly lost the one man that was our biggest fan, because we were all working toward fulfilling his dream. His dream had become our dream.
The greatest leader of our time
has been struck down by the foulest deed of our time. No words are sad enough to express our sense of loss. No words are strong enough to express our determination to continue the forward thrust of America that he began.
Johnson was not going to let the program die. And I think we have to give him credit for pushing to keep going.
The dream of conquering the vastness of space. This is our challenge. Not to hesitate, not to pause, not to turn about and linger over this evil moment, but to continue on our course so that we may fulfill the destiny that history has set for us. John Kennedy's death commands what his life conveyed, that America must move forward. To honor his memory and the future of the works that he started, I have today determined that the NASA Launch Operations Center in Florida shall hereafter be known as the John F. Kennedy Space Center. I have also acted today with the understanding and the support of my friend, the governor of Florida, to change the name of Cape Canaveral. It shall be known hereafter as Cape Kennedy.
I would have paid for the job. It was so wonderful. Just the excitement. Every time I'd go through the gates of Kennedy Space Center and show my badge, I thought I was the luckiest person in the world. I was called a communications specialist. I wrote all the press releases. I interviewed engineers and programmers and top personnel. It took some education, but finally I understood that the I-beamers there did the final system testing for the IU, the instrument unit, which provided the navigation and trajectory for the Saturn V.
I was in awe, to tell you the truth. I was in awe because I had no sense before getting to Kennedy Space Center what it would be like. I was a part of the telemetrics department, and Dr. Blaine Sweat, I'll never forget him. He was my department manager. He made it very clear. He says, I love excellence. I want people who are going to come in here and not only help us to achieve our objective, but to bring what wisdom you have to help us improve upon that.
Now, I'm biased. I did my master's and my doctorate in management, okay? And I will tell you that the technical feats were fabulous. The organization feats were equally fabulous. To be able to put together a team made up of all these different companies and organizations that would function together, and that happened during Apollo. It had to. How would you grow it at the size and speed that it needed to without bringing a lot of different people in?
You know, I wasn't a swinging single, of course, but back when my wife and I first got here in '65 for the Apollo program, we really wanted to live in Cocoa Beach.
It was a little rowdy. You had entertainment at a lot of these motels. We had the astronauts here, obviously.
The astronauts have kind of a free reign.
You betcha. It was commonplace for those guys to get in that sports car and run these roads around here. A lot of them, us workers included, we'd work hard during the daytime, but at night when we wanted to relax, we'd play hard.
Our adventure was the mousetrap.
The mousetrap.
The mousetrap.
The rat house.
The mousetrap.
Mousetrap.
Mousetrap, yeah.
I wasn't in that crowd, but I was aware of what was happening.
It was like a who's who in the space program.
On Fridays, anyone that came in with their tie still on got it cut off. There would be a lot of hooping and hollering.
We talked about things and we laughed about things. It never occurred to me that an environment could be so caught up in this commitment, because I hadn't seen that like that before. The dynamics of Kennedy Space Center was unity. Everybody said, you're a team member. You play a role in helping us to be successful.
North American Aviation won 2 contracts on Apollo. They had the second stage, the S2, and they had the command and service module. So, you know, they had a tremendous part of the whole Apollo vehicle.
You know, one of the things about the command module is it's limited space. It's extremely crowded. You had 3 guys. So we did an awful lot of simulation work. And the problem was knowing the latest configuration with regards to the interior of the capsule, because one minute an instrument would be over here, and study would show that that was not the proper place for it. It should have been over here, and they would move it.
You know, we were a month away from launch. We were still doing modifications to the vehicle. We had been trampling in and out of that vehicle for 6 months, and that does generate mistakes. It generates foolish decisions. It's almost like you're running too fast and you're starting to lose your balance. And I think that's what we felt a little bit back in 1967. That night, I was on station, and I just finished running a simulated static fire with Gus Grissom and Skip Chauvin as the test conductor. And the communications were really bad. Gus was getting ticked. He'd been in the cockpit all afternoon and evening.
Hey, how we gonna get to the moon? We can't talk between 3 buildings. I can't hear that thing you're saying. Right.
And Skip said, let's take a break here and see if we can square this comm system away before we go into the terminal count.
Somehow or another, a spark started in one of the lower areas underneath one of the couches. And unfortunately, we had saturated the atmosphere inside that capsule with 100% oxygen.
That was based on the heritage of both Mercury and Gemini, even though Mercury and Gemini were a very small volume compared to the Apollo capsule. And when you're in 100% oxygen and something ignites, it's almost like an explosion.
We had discussed the procedure for getting out of the capsule in an emergency, and the NASA wanted a redundant system. They wanted a hatch on the outside that opened to the outside, and they wanted a hatch on the inside that opened to the inside. When the fire started, however, the pressure was so great that it just made it seal that much tighter. Ed White was a strong man. There was no way in the world that he could possibly get that hatch off.
The pressure vessel actually ruptured, and the fire blew out of all the ports on the outside of the command module. Burned technicians outside, set papers on fire.
It didn't last very long, but they knew that they were in trouble.
After the pad fire that killed the 3 astronauts, NASA says if we have another disaster of like nature that kills crew, Congress will cut off our funding. That'll be the end of the program. And that was true. Everybody had that attitude. They knew that it was that close to the end of the program.
It didn't take long before our orders came through. This isn't going to happen again. We're going to take another look at everything. And everything, I mean everything. We spent almost an entire year looking back over all of the things we had drawn and built, all of the management decisions that were made.
I was requested by NASA to join a group called the Sneak Circuit Analysis Program to learn how to identify hidden catastrophes and find them before they occur. If you've never seen engineering drawings, you've been blessed, because they don't show what any group needs. They show a composite all mashed together, and nobody can visualize the total effect of what that does. So I was allowed to try something different. I thought, if I'm an electron traveling on that wire can be 100 miles long, and I don't care. I can see the end of it from the beginning. If I can just depict that the way the electron sees it, a simple sketch of a circuit that has power at the top, ground at the bottom, I'll know everywhere current can flow and under what circumstance. Altogether, I don't know how many true sneak circuits we found on all the Apollos. It was in the neighborhood of 1,000.
I guess the change I saw was that people became even more dedicated to doing what needed to be done correctly. If there were any doubt, you would want to go back and look again. These 3 guys gave their lives. We owe them our very best efforts.
At the spacecraft side of the house, we did a real good assessment. What did we need to change to make a safer vehicle? And we did.
It took quite a while to accomplish it, but we went to a single hatch. A device which we call an over-center lock makes it possible to actually have the internal pressure seal the hatch just that much tighter.
And we had to start looking at all of our components that we used in the breathing systems. Some things that we had no idea would be flammable or explosive when they're in a pure O2 environment would burn. We got a wealth of knowledge from that accident that we have used to redesign every oxygen system in the world since then.
In retrospect, you look back now and you realize that maybe if we hadn't had that fire that night and lost those 3 guys, we wouldn't have got to the moon. What I'm afraid of is that somewhere downstream, we may have had another fire, or another situation that we lost the crew in orbit or on the way to the moon. And I think the program would have stopped right there.
Mind-boggling. I have always seen it piecemeal. The first day when they drove me out to the pad as part of my introduction, and I went up on the 180-foot level, and I looked down, and I looked up, I thought, you know, there ain't no way in the world this thing is going to get off the ground. 7 million pounds. How could it ever get off the ground?
I took one look from the top of the pad, and this is the pad where Apollo 11 was going to lift off someday. It was just such a magnificent sight, and I'm sure only a few women have seen it.
early in the Saturn V program, the decision was made to go to an all-up testing.
This was kind of pushed on us by Dr. Mueller from headquarters. He said, hell, you Germans, you're too slow. You just do one stage at a time. Fly it all.
So rather than S1C only, S1C, S2, S1C, S2, S4B, right from the very beginning, fire them all.
It was a nerve-wracking situation, you might say, to some extent. To think that your particular hardware, your area, might cause a catastrophic failure. And I just have to say, yes, it was a constant dread. You know, this was an extremely complex vehicle.
When we started the countdown for the actual launch, I walked into this HOSC building and I never come out for 3 days and 3 nights. Von Braun did a tour. Here's all his engineers asleep on the console. Von Braun said, let them sleep. I want them to be ready when the time comes. I was at a control console with my boss, and we got down to about T-minus 30 seconds, and I thought, excuse me, I'll be right back. I went down the stairs and out in front of the launch control center and stood there watching the launch.
12, 11, 10, 9, ignition sequence start. 5, 4, we have ignition. All engines are running.
The reverberation was just pounding my chest.
Imagine 350 horsepower cars, bumper to bumper, from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific coast, pressing that pedal to the metal. That's 7.5 million pounds of thrust. That's a lot of juice. And when it did finally go, it was so frustratingly slow.
It's not like a shuttle that leaps off. It's doing 100 miles an hour by the time it gets past the tower. You begin to wonder if it's even moving. It's just barely climbing.
You watch it through staging. You think of all the hours that went into that, all the work, all the contemplation, the arguments, the changes, and it worked.
I looked at the records, looked just like I'd done them on my simulator. Nothing was wrong. The first time it had ever flown.
A lot of people don't realize that that was the same year as the fire. That we went from the absolute lowest point in terms of program morale and spirit to launching that giant rocket. You know, we put an unmanned spacecraft on it. Literally the phoenix arising out of the fire.
Once that was completed, I think an awful lot of people said, we can do this. And I think it set the stage for all the ones that followed.
That for me was the most exciting launch because essentially we had arrived. Everything was progressing like it should be, and the future looked brighter than ever.
Do they know about Martin Luther King?
We have left it up to you to let it can be handled.
Could you lower those signs, please? I have some very sad news for all of you, and I think sad news for all of our fellow citizens and people who love peace all over the world. And that is that Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis, Tennessee.
It was an awful year, yeah. We had the assassinations, we had the Vietnam was stoking up, and the riots. And yet, I won't say we were captured by the program, but that's all we were worried about was, okay, well, we can't take care of all these issues outside, but at least we can see if we can get men on the moon. And that was our focus.
You did whatever needed to be done. and you didn't watch the clock. There were times when I spent more than a 24-hour shift at the Kennedy Space Center. So I missed some of my kids' upbringing.
People weren't being forced to work these long hours, but they did so by choice. And I think they were so engrossed with what they were doing and the need to accomplish the work. When 8 hours ended, they didn't want to quit.
I love my job. It came first and foremost, especially those of us that had families. It was hard. And I regret not being able to be there more.
Well, probably the most dramatic change was in my personal life. It was almost like I was married to Apollo. It eventually resulted in a divorce. My former wife and my 2 daughters went back to England. I sometimes wonder how my children grew up. I just don't remember a lot of the events in their lives.
I too suffered from having to go through a divorce. I hate to think it is a space program, and again, we each have our reasons to have to go through that event. But there were a lot of divorces here.
At almost midday Eastern Time, NBC News projected Richard Nixon, the 37th President of the United States, when it became evident he had carried Illinois.
Having lost a close one 8 years ago and having won a close one this year, I can say this: winning's a lot more fun.
We had 4 kids in 5 years. So a lot fell on my wife. When she was pregnant with our 4th child, I was in the countdown for Apollo 8. This would have been December the 20th, 1968, and we launched on December the 21st, the morning of. I go home at the built-in hold while we're fueling the vehicle. She delivers our 4th child in about 45 minutes. I congratulate her and me, and I go back to the firing room and we launch Apollo 8. I called it the best scheduling I have ever heard of.
Well, I'll start with what I was doing. When Apollo 8 was getting ready to launch, I was doing the testing off of the VAB. And I got the news that my father died.
We'd flown the Saturn V twice, and now we're going to put men on top of it. And we weren't just going to go into low Earth orbit, we were going to go around the moon. We'd never sent men out of Earth orbit, and we're going to do all this on this first manned flight.
When they went around and came out on the other side and renewed communication, we knew we'd made it. And then they gave us an image of the Earth, first time it ever been seen by human eyes from outer space, you might say. I mean, even in Earth orbit, you don't get the full concept.
To see the Earth rise, it just builds you up. You know, what I'm doing is worthwhile.
It's now approaching lunar sunrise, and for all the people back on Earth, the crew of Apollo 8 has a message that we would like to send to you. In the beginning, God and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God...
That was on Christmas Eve, 1968.
The whole country seemed to be coming apart at the seams. Apollo was about the only bright spot. It was a bright spot in all of our lives.
Maybe nothing compares to the actual man on the moon, but I'd say that instant just stands out as one that I'll never forget.
Apollo 11 was special because we knew we were going to land on the moon, but it wasn't really very different from a launch vehicle standpoint.
I was on a backup crew, which meant I was done just as things were beginning to get exciting. I left to see what kind of crowds were there all along the roadway from the edge of the gate on into town. I couldn't hardly get through. There were people everywhere.
I was in the control room. It was just another launch. I don't recall anything standing out about it.
Liftoff on Apollo 11.
Obviously, we still had some trepidation. Will it all go right? But it was surprisingly similar to the prior ones. Each time we did it, we felt more confident that we could do it again.
Apollo 11, this is Houston. You are go for TLI, over. Confirm ignition, and the thrusters go. Alright, things look real close.
I was at work, and I knew it was going to happen that day. So I told my manager I was going home. He didn't argue with me. I went home and I was watching on TV all through the sequence.
Throttle down. Set him in the simulator.
The main thing I remember is why in heaven's name did they choose to do it sometime after midnight? Which was very much a personal sort of a thing.
40 feet down, 2.5. Picking up some dust. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. ATA at a descent. Nose control, both auto, descent, engine command override off.
I don't recall the exact hour, but it was like 3 o'clock in the morning. The daughters were, already in bed, and we're saying, oh, they can't miss this. So we dragged them out and put them in front of the TV and said, you've got to watch this. This is history in the making.
Okay, Neil, we can see you coming down the ladder now. Neil, we can see you coming.
I think they're thankful, but at the time, all they wanted to do was sleep.
At the foot of the ladder, the lamb footbeds are only depressed in the surface about 1 or 2 inches, although the surface appears to be very, very fine-grained as you get close to it. It's almost like a powder. I'm going to step off the lamb now. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
I was actually at the Space Center. We were on the top floor of the Central Instrumentation Facility, and I tell you what, it was like an eruption of joy.
Man, great admiration for the people who were willing to go do that. The whole purpose was to put 2 men on the moon and get them back safely. And you couldn't have done that if they hadn't gotten in that spacecraft and said, let's go. I really admire our astronauts.
But you helped get them there.
Yeah, I did, but it wouldn't have mattered if they hadn't gone.
Tell me if you got a picture, Houston. We got a beautiful picture, Neil.
That was the climax, yeah. It was like winning a championship.
Pat myself on the back.
And then go back to work the next day.
That's right.
The fact that we landed successfully was one of the highlights of my life, as far as having the feeling that I had a little something to do with it. I was proud, and I cried in the happiness of it all, you know, in the accomplishments of what these men had done. And then I started worrying about the return trip.
I didn't really take a deep breath until that. I think everybody felt that. Get them back on ground and let them have their parade.
I was standing on the courthouse square.
A couple of the city elders picked Von Braun up and carried him on their shoulders.
That vision sticks with me. Great excitement, pride, knowing that Saturn, the propulsion system, the community had been such an integral part of that.
It demonstrated that with the will of the people and the backing of the politicians and the money, the nation can accomplish wonderful things. That's the way most of us look back on it and say, indeed, we made it happen. We were part of that, and we're proud of it.
Oh, we're going someplace. You got to go orbit. You're looking good. Hey, I'll tell you one thing. It's a first-class ride, Houston.
In '69, when we landed on the moon, things started to close down, and I saw a lot of friends in contractors lose their jobs and have to move away.
You want to know how I feel? I'm pissed. Pure and simple. We were working on this second stage in the VAB. We had a page to report to your office, and there was one of our personnel people with a list of pink papers. And it said, pack up your personal effects and be ready to surrender your badge in 30 days. You're out of here.
Houston, we've had a problem here. Can say again, please. Houston, we've had a problem.
Like all things, there's a beginning and there's an end. And when I was given the word that my services were no longer needed, I left with a heavy heart, and yet with a sense of accomplishment that we had done what we set out to do.
And on the surface, at Bedford, old man. My left hand, I have a feather. In my right hand, a hammer. And hopefully, they'll hit the ground at the same time. How about that?
Man, we come a long way. Look at the size of that rock.
There was already the waning public sentiment. My father took my sister and me down to Apollo 15 launch. The excitement, you could tell, had already died off from what it had been before.
I think you have to put it all in context. The Russians were beaten. We had fulfilled Kennedy's audacious goal, and we did it in style. We were using about 4.5% of the nation's overall budget. We didn't have a good vision of what to do next.
I remember going back into my boss's office. He said, Apollo is eventually coming to an end. I said, no. We're going to build bigger rockets and go to Mars. And he said, well, I want you to start thinking about something other than Apollo. I said, okay, boss. And
Apollo did come to an end. I'd always worked in the Huntsville Operational Support Center. I'd never seen a Saturn fly. So I took annual leave and I took my son to see the last shot to the moon. Miles away, sitting out on all this wasteland, here was this tall, slim Saturn. Pure white, so white you could hardly look at it.
The countdown continuing to move along smoothly. T-minus 90.
There were tens of thousands of people out there. No matter how late it was, if there was a delay, nobody cared.
8, 7, ignition sequence started. All engines are started.
When the countdown went down to 0, you could see all the fire and the smoke. Fire as bright as a welding torch. And smoke just blowing for miles. People were silent. They were just stunned. And then, unexpectedly, a wall of sound hits us. People were staggering, trying to stand up like they were on a ship, rocking in the waves. You could see their lips moving. But even from that distance, it was so loud that you could hear nothing but that sound. And then it starts tilting downrange.
Babe, let's check the angle. 30 seconds, we're going up and away. 30 seconds and 17 is go. Everything your go.
And then it was over. We didn't know it was all over, but it was all over then.
Stand by 3-4. Okay, that's where we need to.
We all realize that the first lunar landing will be a hard act to follow. There's only one moon, and I'm afraid we can't offer many more spectaculars like that in the years to come. The interest and the attention of the space program will now be turned to put all that new capability to use for Earth-related applications for the benefit of man, for the benefit of the taxpayer and his less favored brother in underdeveloped and hungry countries.
When it ended, this brilliant team, this one-of-a-lifetime team, was split up. And we had brilliant engineers who started selling typewriters.
When you lose the team, you start from 0. We lost the team. People with the correct educational backgrounds, people with the right characteristics in terms of their dedication.
People with a lot of hope in their hearts to want to succeed.
And the young people, you know, Apollo was done by people 30 and under primarily. So you had all these folks that's willing to work 12, 18 hours a day to make this happen. And I just don't see another project out there like that.
You know, I wasn't an integral part of it. I had my job, which was to write about these brilliant people. And I felt like I was the witness. I was the voice. I think it's the greatest technological team that's ever been formed.
I have no hesitation in saying the Apollo program was good for the nation.
It created new management philosophies, new management approaches, a lot of technical breakthroughs.
And camaraderie. The nation came together. There were 500,000 people involved.
That's what we need. We need national goals, not unlike the Apollo program. Apply it to health, apply it to education. Bring everybody in on the act. They can have a sense of pride, a sense of belonging, a sense of ownership, and a sense of responsibility.
I think the potential's there. I don't know how to make the case for enough people because we have currently, I guess, a real focus on individual that attitude's not going to cut it if we're trying to reach beyond ourselves. And so you go back to Apollo and say, what made it special? Why did it happen? What can we do today that puts us back on a track like we had? And maybe one of us will come up with an answer. It may not be the answer, but it's one of them. Let's go down that road and see what we find.